So, this was my hallway. Boring, right? Just white walls, nothing on them. And honestly, I barely noticed it. Even every day walking past it, it was forgettable. I figured it was finally time to fix that. I wanted something with some style, so I added board and batten, threw up some art, a lot of art, and now it looks like something straight out of a home decor magazine. But here's the crazy part. I didn't design it. The whole thing AI did for me. Yep, I handed my hallway over to artificial intelligence, and this is what it came up with. Let me show you how I pulled it off. So the first thing I did was dust off the old dial-up internet connection and fire up some AI magic. I gave it a photo of my hallway and said, hey, make this a little less sad and throw in some flair. And what did it do? It completely reimagined the space. Board and batten on the walls, bold artwork, the whole vibe leveled up completely. Honestly, I was blown away. It took a few tries to get here, but once I finally found a photo that I really enjoyed and thought would look great in my space, it was time to get to work. And the first thing that I knew I had to do was figure out how to install board and batten. Once I had a decent idea of what I was doing, I jumped right in and started ripping out the old baseboards. With those out of the way, it was time to prep the new ones. I knew I had to paint them before installing because we have ridiculously thick carpet, and trying to paint afterwards would have been a nightmare.
No, babe. Babe. No, it's wet.
After shooing my cat off the workspace because, of course, he has to inspect everything, I began cutting grooves into the top of my baseboards. These were going to help with installing the MDF on the walls, but more on that in a bit. At first, I tried doing it over on the router table, but soon realized that wasn't the best plan. So I switched gears and set up the table saw with the dado stack. Luckily, this project didn't use the table saw for anything else, so once I set it, I was able to leave it and cut all the baseboard grooves the exact same. Now it was time for installation, which was really easy. I just busted out my brad nailer and nailed them in, and then I could focus on the MDF backer boards. These are huge, so I used my track saw to cut these down. This is by far the best tool for cutting huge sheets. So the track saw is a pretty recent addition to my shop, and honestly, if you're on the fence about getting one, just do it. Seriously, pull the trigger. It's hands down the best tool for cutting large sheet goods. Between the track that guarantees perfectly straight cuts and the dust collection that keeps the mess to a minimum, it's a total game changer. Way better than wrestling with a circular saw. Now on this wall, I had an outlet to work around. The easiest way I found to measure it was to prop the backer board upright in its final position and mark exactly where the outlet needed to go. Once I had that figured out, I took the board back out to the shop and used my multi-tool to cut the opening. That made pretty quick work of it. Once I confirmed the backer boards fit correctly, I laid them down and applied construction adhesive to the underside. With the adhesive in place, they were ready for final installation. In here you can see how handy those grooves in the baseboards are. I can just slide the backer boards right into place without having to wrestle with them. It makes the whole process so much easier and way less frustrating. Plus, there's added benefits that I will go into more detail later. I mark out where the battens are going to go so I know exactly where I can drive nails without them being visible. After another quick checkup and a helping paw from the director of operations, I just kept going, installing the backer boards in the same manner as before. I'm taking my time and making sure each board is level before installation, and I'm driving nails in places that I know will be covered by boards or trim. And now it's time for some trim work. This corner took a little finessing. After some pondering, I realized a super simple fix where I could just cut out a square on the trim piece that the backer board was interfering with, knowing that the next trim piece would hide it. Now I've been holding off on the opposite wall of the hallway because it had way more obstacles. The first thing I needed to do was remove this return vent. It needs to be cleaned up and painted, but this type of matter really gets complicated when you have other small curious beings roaming around. Now, of course, when I uncover something, I find it to be really interesting, and why wouldn't he? So of course, I let him poke his little head around and inspect, but I didn't expect him to literally dive in. Now, luckily for me, and unfortunate for you guys, I was quick enough to drop the camera and grab him before he totally went in and got lost forever, and I probably would be killed by my fiance. Now, with that crisis averted, it was time to prevent the horror from ever happening again. I first attempted to fix this with a piece of cardboard, but I soon found out that was going to be way too flimsy. So then I upgraded to this more hefty piece of plywood. I screwed it into the wall and drilled a few holes on it to keep the return vent returning. I searched online for a replacement vent, but couldn't find an exact match. So we're gonna clean it up, give it a fresh coat of paint, and it'll look good as new. Once it's dried, it can be reinstalled and we can start working on the trim that goes around it. Now the baseboards on the opening of the hallway are a little more complicated because they end abruptly. This meant I needed to stop the groove cut just before the ends of the boards, otherwise the cutout would be visible. With the grooves finished, I could cross cut them to the right length on the miter saw, then they were ready to be installed on the walls. I'm pushing the carpet back here to try to get the baseboards flush with the subfloor. Then a few brad nails and we're all good. And now we've hit another obstacle, the thermostat. It's easy to pop off, but the wiring needs to be undone. To make things easier, I snapped a quick photo to keep track of where all the wires need to go when it's time to reinstall it. Like the other wall, I laid the backer board down where it's going to be installed. Then I marked where I need to make cuts for the return and for the thermostat wires. I find this to be way easier than trying to measure it all out. I use a square here and a straight edge to extend my marks, and then the jigsaw make quick work of it. By the way, if you're ever having any issues with your jigsaw, try installing a new blade. You'd be surprised at the difference it can make. I laid my board on top of some scraps to prevent tear out, and then used a hole saw with, I believe, a 1/2 inch bit on it for where the wires need to come through. I slapped on more construction adhesive and made sure to pull the thermostat wires through the hole here, and then the backer board was ready to be nailed in with like a million brad nails. I knew you guys wanted to see every single brad nail go in. You're welcome. Now over here, I'm doing the exact same thing as the other side. Putting my board in place, marking it, cutting it, a little construction adhesive, and then slapping it in, and 1,000 more brad nails. Now I just repeated the same process with my other panel, and man, did these go up so smooth. Everything was perfectly level and flush. Wait, what's that? Like every house, my walls are not straight. See, this is where the grooves really shine. Since I'm keeping the existing door trim, these backer boards need to line up perfectly with that trim. All that's filling that gap is some caulk. So when I install these, I'm pushing them against the trim to make sure they are flush there. By doing this, the backer ends up tilted ever so slightly, but since it's deep in the groove, you won't ever know. And then the same applies for any discrepancies up top. And now I'm left with a gap between my two backer boards. Well, guess what? This is where my styles are gonna go, and so you'll never see that gap either. Pretty cool, right? Now, since I'm going with a really tall board and batten here, the top of it is gonna be nearly eye level, at least to a 6-foot person. Getting this level is paramount. As such, a laser level really comes in handy. Here, I am finally installing my last backer board, and luckily, I only had one outlet to cut around. And with that finished, I could move on to the top trim, and once that was done, the edge trim. And then once that was done, pretty much the whole shell of the board and batten was finished. All I needed to do now was install the battens. And so I begin on the table saw, where I'm cutting down boards for the battens. Now, since I decided not to remove the door trim, I was only left with about a 1/2 inch for the board and batten total depth. And when you account for the board being a 1/4 of an inch, that left me a 1/4 of an inch for these battens. Now, you can't go to Home Depot and buy 1/4 of an inch trim, so I had to make my own. The only thing I needed after cutting them to length was to give each front-facing edge a slight round over. So I had to go out and actually buy a 1/16 inch round over bit. Now, the battens match the rest of the trim. I used my Fusion 360 model and marked out exactly where all the battens need to go. For each batten, I went out to the hallway and took a vertical measurement to ensure a tight fit on each and every one. This was when I really got to see the project come together. Also see if my 3D model was accurate. I modeled and measured like 10 times to ensure that a batten wasn't gonna fall on an outlet or switch, but you just never know. And with the last one up, I stood there wondering, why do I ever doubt myself? I only use brad nails to install these, no adhesive. And the one thing that really matters here is getting them square before you nail them in. Unlike the previous nail holes, these won't be covered, so I tried not to butcher them. Now comes one of the most important parts of a project like this, covering up all the mistakes. I start with filler and go around covering all of my leftover pinholes. Then it was time for caulk, and a lot of it. You need to caulk every single seam, and if that seems like it's going to take forever, it definitely did. I will say that buying a dripless caulk gun made this process a whole lot smoother and less messy. Now to the paint. I almost went with a pop color on the board and batten, but knew I wanted a bunch of photos on the walls and I didn't want all of that to clash. Plus, the AI render had all white walls, so that's what we're going with. This board and batten alone adds so much character to the space. It really looks elevated already. But we're gonna elevate it even more. I spent hours driving to every nearby Goodwill to purchase all of their dollar frames. This saves so much money, plus you inherently get a nice diverse selection. I was biased towards frames with mats, well, because every frame should have a mat. But right here, I was a little discouraged. Let's face it, they look hideous. And I was doubting whether new art would actually fix that or not. I pushed on, and swapped out the art in over 40 different frames. After I had the frames, I then decided which art piece would go in each frame. I scaled them appropriately and then printed them off on giant poster boards, which also saved a bunch of money. Now, people see these frames that come with the art already installed in the factory and think because there's a sealed back, new art cannot be installed in them as easily. But really, it's the same frames with paper glued on the back, which you can just cut off. The Goodwill frames were a steal at $1 each, but man, cleaning both sides of the glass on every single one was a grind. Totally worth it though. Now that the glass is sparkling and the art is in, this is actually starting to look legit. So it's time we talk about the AI art. Now, I'm not going to dive into this completely because I've spent months working on generating AI art, but I'll give you the gist of it. I use a combination of programs including Stable Diffusion and Flux. If you want to learn more about them, just Google them. The software is free, and with a powerful enough computer, you can produce the same art as me, all for free. Here, I took a photo of a landmark and told the AI to replicate it in like a pastel water brush paint style. It'll spit out a few versions and you're pretty much finished. I also asked it to replicate some of my favorite artists and to create unrealistic scenes that reminded me of some of my family's weird, quirky adventures. Honestly, it's limitless on what it can do. Have fun, go wild. After a month of curating art, this project was finished. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy on AI image generation, and I understand that, but I will say this project was such a fun way to explore AI's possibilities and allowed me to continue pushing my creating skills. I hope you enjoyed watching the video. See you at the next one.